Welcome to Diversity Matters, where we examine issues related to inclusion and the media. In this episode, we return to the issue of Gaza, with a focus on the level of violence that journalists there are facing and how that war is being reported around the world, especially in Europe. The UN says the number of journalists killed, around 250, should shock the world. Its independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory says Israel has committed genocide. For this discussion, I hand over to Martin Gak, a journalist based in Germany who writes Inconclusive Thoughts. He's speaking to Hanno Hauenstein, a Berlin-based journalist and author who recently wrote an article for The Guardian criticising German media for its coverage.
Hanno Hauenstein, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
A pleasure to have you here. And just let me start with the article you wrote for how German media outlets helped pave the way for Israel's murder of journalists in Gaza, which you wrote about 2 weeks ago, I think, or it was published about 2 weeks ago at The Guardian. Can you just walk me through the kind of things that you have seen and why you identify German media as paving the way to the murder of these journalists like Anas al-Sharif and al-Daga?
Well, so this specific article grew out of a real sense of frustration that has built over the past 2 years that isn't particularly new, but I felt it just had reached another level. We've seen Bild-Zeitung, which, as you well know, is Germany's biggest newspaper, the flagship outlet tabloid outlet in Germany's largest publisher, which, by the way, is also Europe's largest publisher, Axel Springer, posting a headline a few hours after Anas al-Sharif was targeted and assassinated, one must say, by the Israeli military. The headline read, and I'm paraphrasing, but it read something along the lines of like terrorists disguised as journalists killed in Gaza. So just the level. This headline was later changed to journalist was allegedly disguising as a terrorist. So I think Bild understood that this first headline was maybe too harsh, but it was up to 10 to 12 hours or so. And it kind of I think it's just indicative of the direction that like many conservative right-wing media outlets in Germany, but also liberal-leaning outlets in Germany have gravitated towards, which is like, an incredible amount of credulity towards state narratives, be it German state narratives or Israeli state narratives, and state sources when it comes to reporting on the issue of Palestine and Israel. And we've just seen time and again in really from Taz, from left-wing outlets up to Bild-Zeitung, which is maybe the farthest to the right of the end of the line of the established media outlets in Germany, that this has become a pattern, that this is a structural issue. We see time and again that military spokespersonnel is quoted as a legible source without giving you sufficient context of the history of disinformation and misinformation that is traceable way before October 7th on the part of the Israeli military. And we've seen, besides that, also like a very peculiar use of like kind of passive language when it comes to victims in Gaza, as opposed to very active language when it comes to Israeli victims of this war/genocide. So these two elements taken together with also like a real erasure of Palestinian voices and sources, especially in the news reporting on what has been happening in Gaza, I think is really shaping up to something where we can no longer just speak of the media kind of failing its own proclaimed journalistic ethics, but actively contributing to something like the legitimizing of the endangering and essentially also the targeting of journalists in Gaza.
Let me ask you this. I mean, you say that it paves the way. Why can this not be simply read as some sort of internal conversation within the German public? I mean, in what way do you feel that this actually has an impact in the way in which Israel is deploying military force against journalists?
Look, I've been traveling to and reporting from both Israel and Palestine, the West Bank and Israel for close to 15 years now. And if there's one thing that I've understood over those past 15 years is that nothing is going to change within Israeli society without outside pressure. What we're seeing today is that despite the fact that like people in countries around the world are protesting and are, shocked in deep ways by what the Israeli military and government is doing in Gaza, it still isn't enough because there's no change coming from governments or countries abroad. And I think this pressure, the media, and I'm saying this with a grain of salt because I'm really I've grown very skeptical of a kind of generalizing language of the media. I think it's very important that we differentiate between journalists who are doing good work on the ground and journalists abroad who often do very careless work and very kind of biased work. And I think it's important to make those differentiations, but nevertheless, we have to address this as a structural issue. So I think in that sense, I'll say the word the media has an important role in shaping up public opinion and in also like shaping up the degree to which people are either accepting what is happening with their government support or are resisting to what is happening with their taxpayer money.
So in a way, I guess it looks a bit like, I mean, part of the argument seems to be that, there is a way in which this kind of narrative that points to journalists in Gaza as terrorists gives permission, allows the public to say, well, this is what, in any case, these people are. So go ahead and do whatever you feel.
Of course, yes. Look at the case of Anas Zaid Fateya, the photojournalist in Gaza, who just last week, I reported about it in The Intercept. He filed a legal action in a German court against Axel Springer because of like an article published in Bild Zeitung in which actually the direction of travel of the kind of usual sort of propaganda apparatus was actually reversed. It was not the case that Israel had put out a statement linking Fateya to Hamas or suggesting that he is in one way or another adjacent to Hamas, as is so often the case before journalists are being targeted and killed. It was actually the other way around. So Süddeutsche had published an article about the question whether images coming from Gaza depicting starvation, hunger, famine, whether those images are believable or not. And they used under the headline of like how to what I mean I'm paraphrasing, but to what extent can we trust the images? So they used an image of Anas Fateya photographing people waiting in line in a food distribution site in Gaza, and the kind of implicit suggestion was that this image is staged. It wasn't spelled out that way in the Süddeutsche article. And Fateya's name was also not used. So this article was, if you ask me personally, I think this article was misleading because it suggested that generally we can't really trust the images coming out of Gaza. Nevertheless, it didn't target Fateya. However, like a day after or so, Bild Zeitung took up the Süddeutsche research and targeted Fateya directly. And like what I said earlier, the direction of travel was worse. Is that like basically Bild Zeitung published an article under the headline of like this journalist in Gaza is staging Hamas propaganda, depicting Fateya using his title journalist in quotation marks, making a very strong case for the fact that like this person is up for grabs, basically. Like this is not a real journalist. He's basically serving Hamas the propaganda images and he's exaggerating or staging whatever we in the West perceive as a famine. By the way, only 2 weeks after actually the UN confirmed that there is a real famine happening in Gaza, but that's another issue. But this article then, only to finish that point, was then taken up by the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the so-called GHF, the Gaza Health Foundation, which is supposed to distribute food in Gaza, by the Israeli embassy in Germany. So, I mean, like this is a clear case where actually a German media outlet provides the material for delegitimization.
What I find quite interesting about the story of Fateya, particularly, is the pollinization of Süddeutsche Zeitung, Springer, and then all of these ministries and the Israeli government itself, because it shows you in some way the manner in which platforming an ideological position can be very much at the center of agenda setting, right? Agenda setting is quite literally what happened. Two different publications push the story, and then basically it gets replicated and used for justification. I wanted to ask you, I mean, about this specific issue, which really kind of I guess echoes through this entire story, which is this platforming of Israeli talking points with very, very little pushback and almost no hard questions, no tough interviewing stages. And as you pointed out, almost no presence of Palestinian voices. I mean, in some cases, not at all.
Yes. Yes, I think the latter has very slightly shifted now in the German media environment. I think we've heard over the past 2 years probably more Palestinian voices than we've heard over the past 20 years in the German media environment. Like, I think there's now a kind of growing understanding that this should change, but it's nowhere near enough. It will be, what I often do in my personal journalism is just like speak to journalists on the ground or to people on the ground in Gaza, which are fairly easy to reach if you have a social media account. And this happens rarely in established German media outlets. So I mean, I really am asking myself, and I think these two issues, like you point out, they go hand in hand. The kind of like credulity towards state outlets, Israeli state outlets, and the disinformation over what sources are supposedly believable or not goes hand in hand with the real absence of narrative and an absence of diversity of voices. I mean, like it's just not enough if we only have someone like Ahmed Mansour. Think of him what you like, or the two other Palestinian names that have sort of quote unquote digestible positions to a mainstream German media audience. Like I think it's just not enough in a situation where we're at, where people are being slaughtered in the tens of thousands. I mean, we need different perspectives in order to understand the situation on the ground.
For people that might not know, Ahmed Mansour is essentially the certified, well-behaved, pretty much Israel defending Palestinian that does the rounds in German media. I actually wanted to ask you about not only the lack of Palestinian voices in German media, but something that has been pointed out really across the board, even British media, American media, and Mehdi Hassan a couple of days ago made the case on an American stage, which is that the repetition of this claim that, the Israelis are not letting media in, which in fact is true, they're not letting media in, but usually implying that there are no journalists in Gaza, that there is no journalistic coverage in Gaza, which is very much consistent with this claim that whatever is coming out of Gaza is not to be believed. What do you make of this, and particularly in the German context?
Well, I mean, tragically, so it becomes increasingly more true, right? I mean, like one has to say, like that, Israel has been very successful in not only, restricting access to Gaza to international media, but also to actively silencing the journalists on the ground. I mean, I spoke to a colleague at Al Jazeera the other day. I think they had for the first time in like these 2 years, they had like an internal call on what is actually transpiring after Anna Sharif and four other colleagues of Al Jazeera were killed. And it's just like, it's honestly hard to comprehend. But yes, of course, there are journalists in Gaza, and it's, I think even I don't generally call into question the idea of like looking at people critical regarding as to which outlets they work for. I look at people critical who work for Axel Springer. I don't read their articles. I would never give them an interview. And I understand why someone who might have a different political position than I have looks at someone who works for Al Jazeera in a similar way. Nevertheless, I don't legitimize the killing of that person. And like in a situation where I have no access, I find it ludicrous to exclude such a voice from the general scope of reporting. I mean, if the people are on the ground, talk to them, offer them a way to publish their articles, or give them a way to publish their photography, and the fact that this is in Germany called into question in general, even by journalist associations like the DJV, who published a really disgraceful note on the supposed non-believability of the photography coming out of Gaza. I think that was end of July, beginning of August. This is just like telling you, the kind of parameters are twisted in a way. Like it's there.
I mean, can you explain, can you give a little bit of background on that story? Because it was actually an important story.
Yeah, in a way, it also set the stage for the article that was later on published in Süddeutsche, since the DJV element was also quoted there and also quoted in Bild-Zeitung on Fetea. So it's one of the Germany's biggest journalists associations, which they have an important role because much of what happens in journalism is a kind of gray zone in between, a sort of like industry ethics and then like the real laws that exist. So these associations really matter as they kind of mediate between those two guidelines. And they published basically an article quoting yet another article that was very tendacious in I think it was in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung back in the day, suggesting that the images of people of especially children suffering starvation and hunger in Gaza are not really believable, as they conceal the fact that these children often have like primary diseases which are actually, and this was the insinuation that these primary illnesses are actually the real reason for the state that they're in. Now, there's a few issues, and like there was a doctor, I'm not a doctor, but there was a doctor who wrote a very kind of fact-based piece on this, also in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which you can look up. I'll give you the name later on. You can write it somewhere in these show notes. But there's no way in medical history that children who have these diseases that were hinted at in this article look the way kids look in Gaza. It just is not possible. That's one. Two is everyone in the medical community is very acutely aware of the fact that like hunger stops healing. It's no rocket science. Like if you want someone who is sick to become better, you need nutrition, you need food. Those two things are inextricably linked, and the fact that like this suggestion sort of being, are we questioning now like whether kids in Sudan are actually like suffering typhus or another sickness, but not starvation when we picture them as being starved? I mean, like this is such a strange kind of direction of discourse, and the fact that the major journalist association would actually reproduce those stances and depict colleagues in Gaza while they are being killed systematically as producing kind of propaganda instead of actual journalism, I think is, to me, quite scandalous, honestly.
Let me ask you perhaps a last question, or rather a thought for you to comment on. I became acutely aware during my years at Deutsche Welle that part of the mantle of security that as a journalist I had a lot to do with my institutional affiliation. So in a sense, I think that the lack of Palestinian voices, sort of obviously, one can talk about the lack of diversity, but it also seems to me that was a way to deny them both a home and a shelter. Not only as journalists, but also as, people in a situation of extreme and grave conflict. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure if the Israeli military really cares that much in the end of the day. Probably they do check, what kind of institutional.
But wouldn't you say that the German public might?
I would hope so. But like I don't think that like Süddeutsche can. I'm wondering whether they can just employ those people, right? I mean, like from abroad. I mean, I know that there are people who work with that journalists in Gaza who work with Tagesschau and ARD, ZDF. I know that these kind of there are rare kind of examples of this, but most of the photographers, for example, they get their work commissioned as freelancers to agencies that then sell them to international outlets, and like these outlets distribute them to CNN, The Guardian, New York Times, all the Western outlets as well, and whether that gives them institutional protection or not, I'm not so sure. And like, I would hope that, like, assuming the kind of theoretical scenario that like, say, like Süddeutsche or Zeit would employ someone in Gaza, that would give them protection. but I'm not sure it really necessarily would. I mean, like I've come to deconstruct all my kind of naive hope that people are more protected than others by virtue of being affiliated with one outlet or another. But like it's what we see is that it really offers very little protection, if any, at all.
So, Hanno, thank you very, very much. Have a good afternoon. Talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for your work, Martin, and for your time.
My thanks to Martin and Hanno for their insights and for joining Diversity Matters. This podcast is brought to you by Media Diversity Institute, or MDI. You can listen to earlier episodes and find more information on MDI on our website, media-diversity.org. Thank you for joining us. Take care.